And we are live on the Voice of the Cape Facebook and YouTube platforms for the VOC Matric Revision session today. The subject is History Grade 12, and that's Paper 2 Revision with Danielle Pretorius. She is an educator for the Futures Academy Online High School. And do also note that you can also access the notes to this session on their website, which is www.futuresacademy.co.za. So, without further delay, I now hand over to you, Danielle, to proceed with the lesson.
Thank you. Awesome. So, hi, grade 12s. You'll remember that last week we were busy with our paper 1, part 2. And then today, what we're doing is we're revising for the paper 2. Okay, let's, before we start with the work, quickly look at the examination guidelines for the paper 2. So, there are 3 topics. Remember, you will only be really writing on 2. So, you will have to answer one source-based, one essay, and then the last one could be either a source-based or an essay. So for today, we're going to go through civil resistance, 1970s to 1980s in South Africa. The question focus for the source-based is the crisis of apartheid in the 1980s. And then the essay question for the section is the challenge of Black consciousness to the apartheid state. So we'll try to go through these 2 today, and then next week we'll be going through this section here. Okay. So civil resistance in South Africa from the 1970s to the 1980s. So the challenge of Black consciousness to the apartheid state. You remember that the essay question is on Black consciousness as well. So apartheid was a legalized and institutionalized form of racism that ensured white South Africans had all the political power in South Africa. Okay, so this is important. This is the definition of apartheid if they ask you that. The system was introduced in 1948 by the National Party, NP. The system consisted out of 2 systems of apartheid. Firstly, the grand scheme of apartheid and the petty scheme of apartheid. The petty scheme of apartheid segregated every aspect of society, where grand apartheid was the system of the separate homelands that existed. Okay, so apartheid oppressed Black South Africans who were denied any rights and suffered discrimination and humiliation due to racist laws. Passive resistance campaigns were organized during the 1950s, and the apartheid government reacted harshly to anyone who opposed its politics. Okay, so you'll remember from the civil resistance section on America for the paper 1 that passive resistance is where there is no violence, and active resistance is where violence is used. Main resistance movements like the African National Congress, the ANC, and the PAC, the Pan-African Congress, were banned after the 1960 Sharpeville massacre. Okay, so the ANC and the PAC, in response to this, formed their armed wings to continue their struggle against apartheid. Armed wings as in military sections. So the ANC formed Mkhonto we Sizwe, MK, and they specialized in sabotage attacks, while the PAC formed POCO, who aimed to launch a revolutionary uprising. Okay, so why was resistance difficult in the 1960s, and why do we only actually start to see resistance forming around the 1970s? So in the 1960s, resistance movements were infiltrated by security police. The leaders were imprisoned on Robben Island or had gone into exile into Europe and Africa. And the 1967 Terrorism Act allowed them to detain people without a trial indefinitely, meaning that they could basically put people in jail without a trial. Torture and abuse of prisoners to get information regarding resistance activities also happened. Okay, then we get to the Black consciousness movement, and we'll go into this a little bit more in depth just now, but here's just basically kind of a rundown. So the emergence of the Black consciousness movement in the 1970s revived the freedom struggle, and resistance to apartheid government intensified after the 1976 Soweto Uprising. This is the reason we celebrate Youth Day. In response to the growing opposition, the government tried to reform its policies but was unsuccessful. these reforms were also very superficial and didn't actually mean anything for the people of South Africa. Anti-apartheid forces mobilized support to make the country ungovernable. By the 1980s, apartheid was in a crisis because it was impossible to control the unrest in townships. The formation of bodies like the United Democratic Front and the Mass Democratic Movement meant that protest was better organized and therefore more difficult to defeat. Also, the growing international opposition, which took place in forms of sports and cultural boycotts, economic sanctions, and disinvestment, resulted in the NP losing support of white South Africans. Okay, so how did the apartheid state look in the 1970s and the 1980s? So apartheid became increasingly oppressive in the 1970s and 1980s as the state employed its security and military forces to stamp out any resistance. While white South Africans reaped the benefits of apartheid, African, colored, and Indian South Africans faced discrimination, deprivation, and humiliation. Apartheid resulted in forced removals as well as repressive measures. So forced removals as in removing people from where they lived and moving them to the homelands. The NP entered its third decade of rule in the 1970s, and it was confident that it would overcome resistance and would continue its plan of separate development for South Africa. Okay, so pressure increased on apartheid, so the pressure to end apartheid, because there was a sharp rise in the price of oil, and that had a negative effect on the South African economy. The growth in trade unionism and illegal strikes were of great concern to both industrialists and businessmen, so business people, who demanded that the government review its labor policies. Okay, so the fact that trade unions started to establish themselves and that people were striking illegally, this frustrated businesses, and they asked for better labor policies for their workers because it was affecting their profits. South Africa's economy was very strong in the 1960s, slowing down in the 1970s, and by the 1980s, it was in a recession. Influx control began to collapse as millions of workers migrated from their homelands to the cities because it wasn't possible for police to enforce past laws. So you remember from last year when you guys were also learning about this, is that influx control is where they try to control the inflow of Black workers to urban areas with pass laws, but this system started breaking down and millions of workers migrated to urban areas, to cities from the homelands. Okay, other issues. The barrier of protective white rule states surrounding the country and which kept guerrilla soldiers out was broken when Mozambique and Angola gained independence in 1975. So we kind of have these two states buffering South Africa from the rest of Africa, and as these fall and become not racist regimes, it starts to create a problem for South Africa where now they are vulnerable. The emergence of the Black Conscious movement, which was led by Steve Biko, removed the feeling of hopelessness and apathy experienced by many and inspired people to resist apartheid with renewed vigor. The 1976 Soweto Uprising was a turning point in the freedom struggle as resistance to apartheid became better organized and more effective. Okay, so what is P.W. Botha's total strategy that he had implemented? So during the 1970s, internal unrest increased. The UNO and the Commonwealth advocated trade sanctions against South Africa. The buffer states of Mozambique and Angola became independent states ruled by Black governments. And in response to these developments, Prime Minister P.W. Botha developed a policy known as Total Strategy. Okay, so what did Total Strategy do? Its purpose was to try protect white rule by enforcing the following measures. So firstly, putting across a message that South Africa faced the threat of the USSR taking over Southern Africa and was fighting a war against the total onslaught of communistic forces. Reagan, USA president, and Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, were both anti-communist and resisted the pressure from the UN, the Commonwealth, and their own people to impose sanctions on South Africa. They increased the period of military conscription for all white men over the age of 18 to 2 years, thus strengthening the South African Defence Force. They destabilized neighboring countries by launching cross-border attacks and supporting groups resisting the governments of these countries. They started introducing reforms in order to win the support of the middle class, Black South Africans. However, these were very superficial, as mentioned before. They began to do away with petty apartheid laws and introduced a Trichomeral Parliament, which gave limited power to Indians and Coloureds. Africans were excluded from this parliament. Moreover, in this parliament, as whites held the majority of the vote, the Indians and Coloureds actually technically didn't have a say because the white powers could just veto it. Okay, so the crisis was created because it had failed to overcome the forces of resistance, and apartheid began to lose white support. Okay, now let's move to the second section of the work. Okay, so the opposition to apartheid. So there were three types. We have underground, in prison, and in exile. And then we're going to discuss each of these quickly. So the underground resistance was the forming of the armed wings by the ANC and PAC. Umkhonto we Sizwe was formed by the ANC, and it was an underground military force. It would be used for the armed struggle against apartheid. Okay, then they give us some information about the formation of MK. So it went against the policy of the ANC of nonviolence and was a highly controversial decision at the time, but their aim was to force the government to negotiate with the ANC. Okay, POCO was formed by the PAC, and they did not avoid bloodshed. Their aim was to bring about revolutionary change. Small groups of people were organized in cells, and tasks such as communication, political education, propaganda, and military training took place. The cells had open recruitment policies. This means that it was easy for people to join, which resulted in the security police finding it easy to infiltrate it by just sending spies to the meetings, as there was open recruitment policies in the cells. And by the 1970s, most ANC underground structures within the country were destroyed, and MK hadn't fired a single shot. The opposition in the early 1970s was badly organized and severely ineffective, and changed when Black consciousness ideas inspired a revival. After the 1976 Soweto Uprising, thousands of young people slipped over the borders and joined the ANC and PAC in exile. We'll speak about the 1976 Soweto Uprising in more detail just now. Because of this, they were able to rebuild their underground structures. They were aided by the following socioeconomic factors. So the rapid growth of young people joined the ANC's underground structures, the growing urban middle class, which was well educated and prepared to assume leadership roles, and the ANC prisoners who had been released used their experience to help rebuild the underground structures. These underground structures became active in communicating information to MK and hiding arms, and it also made contact with other organizations such as the United Democratic Front and COSATU, which is a trade union, and the ANC became more successful after 1980. Okay, so because of government repression, many thousands of political activists were arrested and imprisoned. Political prisoners were often kept in solitary confinement and subjected to interrogation. Many detainees died in police custody, and the excuse used by the security police for these deaths was usually suicide. Okay, and then you'll remember that political prisoners were sent to Robben Island and were isolated from the rest of Africa. The most popular ones would be Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Javon Mbeki. The prisoners in jail organized themselves and kept their solidarity, so they kept their allegiance to the ANC and each other. That's basically what it means to have solidarity. The ANC established a political structure known as a high organ that dealt with internal discipline and communication between prisoners, and prisoners debated political issues and made a concerted effort to further their education. And then in exile, so leaders of the ANC, PAC, and SACP went into exile to escape arrest in South Africa. Many of them based themselves in Africa and Europe, and their mission was to continue the struggle by publicizing the injustice of apartheid and by obtaining funds to support them from foreign countries. Owa Tambo had the task to establish a task force to gain support for the ANC's liberation struggle. He was a skilled diplomat and made effective progress in the following areas. Firstly, the ANC gained access to the UN. Secondly, Eastern Bloc and Scandinavian countries provided the ANC with resources and funding. And thirdly, Owa Tambo gained sympathy for the plight of South Africans, which resulted in the launch of campaigns in European countries to boycott South African products. MK recruits received guerrilla training in the Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc countries, and states in North Africa. The Tanzanian government gave soldiers uniforms and 1 meal per day, and South Africans began to receive broadcasts of the ANC's Radio Freedom from Zambia in 1973. This informed South Africans about what the ANC was doing and encouraged them to continue the struggle. The MK established military bases in Angola and Mozambique, and guerrilla soldiers started entering South Africa from there. Young people who had fled the ANC bases now entered the country armed with AK-47 machine guns, hand grenades, and limpet mines. Although MK incursions, so like attacks, were never a serious security threat, they had a tremendous impact because they made the state seem vulnerable. Acts of sabotage unsettled the white population and boosted the morale of those fighting within the country. Okay, then the second section, the challenges of Black consciousness to the apartheid state. And this is where we're going to speak about Black consciousness a bit more in depth. Remember, this is important because this is your essay question, which is on this. Okay. So what we're going to talk about is the nature and aim, the origins, and then also the major players in Black consciousness. So Steve Biko, and then the 1976 Soweto Uprising. So for your essay, you would have to talk about the things on these 2 pages. Okay. So the nature and aim of the Black consciousness movement. So effective resistance against apartheid was crushed in the early 1960s, as we learned. However, Black consciousness ideas inspired a revival of the anti-apartheid struggle in the 1970s. It began as a university student movement, which was led by Steve Biko. It aimed to conscientize Black people and instill in them a sense of self-worth and confidence. To conscientize, to make them aware of what was happening was not right and they deserved better. Black consciousness changed the way Black South Africans saw themselves and empowered them to confront the apartheid regime. Okay, and then the origins of Black consciousness in South Africa. Obviously, when you think about the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, we can also think about the Black Power movement in America, which we had covered a short while ago. So it was based on a number of ideas from various African nationalist movements that promoted Black pride and power. These nationalist movements included Pan-Africanism, the Negritude movement, and obviously the Black Power movement in the USA. Okay, so Pan-Africanism called for unity again of all Africans and those of African descent. It created solidarity and unity amongst Africans, and numerous South Africans embraced Pan-Africanism. So think about Robert Sobukwe, who started the Pan-African Congress when he broke away from the ANC, when he was inspired by the ideas of Pan-Africanism. So the Pan-African Congress believed that Africans should liberate themselves from apartheid without foreign influences. And then the Negritude movement, which was an ideological and literary movement that basically just stated that the oppressed needed to liberate their minds and embrace their own cultures and values. And Steve Biko drew on these ideas to create the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. And then the Black Power movement inspired people to be proud of who they were and to liberate themselves without the help of sympathetic whites. Okay, so these were all like kind of adapted, and from this we have the Black consciousness movement. So the aims and ideas of Black consciousness, it rejected the term non-white. Blackness was considered a positive concept, and they encouraged Africans to take pride in their culture and heritage. It encouraged Black solidarity. It encouraged them to be self-reliant, to build sustainable organizations at a community level, to end dependency on whites, to achieve psychological and physical freedom from feelings of inferiority, and to liberate themselves and not rely on help from liberal whites. Okay, and then the 1976 Soweto Uprising. And this is a very big part in the resistance, and kind of just empowered people in that way to increase the resistance towards the apartheid government. So learners at schools in Soweto had many grievances regarding the education they received. The government spent 15 times as much on white education as it did on Black education. There was a lack of equipment, libraries and sporting facilities, and a severe shortage of classrooms and teachers that led to overcrowding. The curriculum was limited, and many subjects only prepared learners for manual and unskilled labor. The event that triggered mass protest in June 1976 was the introduction of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction in Black schools in the Southern Transvaal region. Learners boycott their classes, and there are unsuccessful meetings between teachers and the Department of Bantu Education. The Soweto Representative Council organized a protest for 16 June 1976. Okay, what do we as South Africans celebrate on the 16th of June? We celebrate Youth Day. It's a public holiday, and we're supposed to remember the 1976 Soweto Uprising and the effect on the youth. That is why it's Youth Day. So they walked to Orlando Stadium while singing freedom songs and waving banners. It was a peaceful rally, and no one envisaged any violence, so no one instigated any violence. 50 policemen tried to stop the students in Vilakazi Street near Orlando West Junior Secondary School and to turn them back. However, the students refused to turn back. Police tried to disperse them using tear gas, releasing police dogs, and firing warning shots. Then the police fired live ammunition at the crowd. Hector Peterston and Hastings Ndlovu were killed, and hundreds more were injured. Furious students went on a rampage through the streets of Soweto and burned down the government buildings there. News of the uprising quickly spread, and protests began in townships across South Africa. The actions of the youth of Soweto paved the way for a renewed fight against apartheid, and 16 June 1976 was a turning point in South African history as it spearheaded countrywide protest. You guys might have also seen the picture of Hector Peterson. It's a very popular picture. If we have time after class, I will show it to you guys. Okay, then the results of the 1976 Soweto Uprising. Okay, so what's important to note is that it resulted in a lot of people, young people, leaving the country and joining MK or POCO. So a nationwide uprising against apartheid was set in motion as a growing number of people became involved in anti-apartheid resistance, and the international community was shocked by the shooting of unarmed students and thus imposed sanctions and embargoes on South Africa. Hundreds of students were imprisoned, and many young people fled into exile and joined either MK or POCO. And then we get to this section here. So the crisis of apartheid in the 1980s, which was fueled by all of this stuff happening in the 70s. So the apartheid state was weakened in the 1980s by internal and external pressures. Internal challenges included widespread violence in townships, a deteriorating economy, and an increase in strike action by the workers. International sanctions weakened the economy, and South African businessmen lost confidence in the government. Okay, then the government attempts to reform apartheid because people start losing faith in the government. So Prime Minister P.V. Botha used this policy of total strategy to bring about reform and greater repression. This aimed to use increased security measures to stamp out resistance, won the support of the black middle class, and to appease Western powers by making apartheid look less racist. In order to maintain white rule, apartheid needed to be changed. Strategies were proposed to modify and modernize apartheid. These so-called reforms aim to restructure labor, create a black middle class, and institute a new government that included coloreds and Indians. These changes were superficial and were met with growing resistance, and the government retaliated with increased repression, and the 1980s became one of the most violent periods in South African history. Okay, so then the contradictions of apartheid start to emerge. By the late 1970s, it became clear that apartheid policies were holding back the economy and development of South Africa. Contradictions included the creation of black homelands, the labor laws, and pass systems. It was apparent that the scheme of grand apartheid was no longer viable. The homelands couldn't support themselves economically, and those that had become independent were not internationally recognized. So basically, still part of South Africa. Separate development had failed because the homelands remained politically and economically linked to South Africa, and the cost of maintaining these homelands was astronomical. One of the central contradictions was the segregation and control of labor. The cities needed African workers, but the presence of Africans in cities was kept to a minimum by means of restricting African urban housing and, of course, the pass laws. Industries struggled to establish a permanent, skilled labor force. Big businesses demanded change in these labor laws, and South Africa's economy was based on the export of primary products. During the 1970s, there was a decrease in demand of primary products, and South Africa needed skilled labor to be able to develop the manufacturing sector of our economy. The pass laws were designed to control the movement of Africans into urban areas. Mass black urbanization began in the 1970s as millions of Africans defied the pass laws and went into cities to escape poverty and overcrowding in the homelands. The influx control began to crumble as it was just too costly and difficult to maintain. Then the pass system starts to break down. Okay, so pass laws were ignored and the influx control began to break down. These laws were thus repealed and a new policy of quote-unquote orderly urbanization was introduced. This policy still controlled black urbanization as it restricted the supply of black housing and the availability of land for black occupation. The result, this is what we see now with Khayelitsha and other areas, an uncontrolled growth of squatter camps outside major cities. Because of these pass laws and because these people couldn't find land or housing, but they needed work, they ended up making squatter camps outside cities because they needed to be near the cities to work. The 1986 Abolition of Influx Control Act dismantled one of the cornerstones of apartheid, and Africans were finally recognized as permanent urban dwellers, and the migrant labor system fell away. Okay. So the labor movement becomes more powerful. Okay, so when we spoke about the skill shortage and the strikes before. So in the 1970s, these necessitated change, and the government set up the Vian Commission to carry out an investigation of industrial relations. This commission proposed that African workers be incorporated into the definition of employees and be permitted to form and join trade unions. The recognition of these trade unions would enable the government to control the growing union movement. Result, the trade unions became powerful organizations over which the government had no control, and workers realized their power and became key players in the struggle against apartheid. Because our economy was dependent on black labor. Okay, so Africa's economy had been dependent on cheap black labor since the discovery of minerals in the 19th century. So, in the 1800s, if you think about the discovery of gold in South Africa. The bulk of the workforce was migrant laborers, and they had no rights or benefits and were not allowed to form trade unions. Corporations invested in South Africa as the availability of cheap labor enabled them to make better profits, but by the 1970s, many white businessmen were demanding the restructuring of the labor policy. Tight influx control, curbs of black job advancement, and an education that trained Africans only for manual labor had a negative effect on the industry. If you think about the Bantu Education Act, which gave Africans like very subpar education in order to keep them in the lower section of the economy. Industries needed a skilled, stable workforce, and this is what apartheid labor policies prevented. Okay, then the 1982 Bantu Authorities Act. So this is where they tried to create a black middle class. So in an attempt to create a black middle class, the government set up initiatives in townships such as introducing 99-year leaseholds so that township residents could buy houses rather than rent them. Trade restrictions in townships were lifted and black minibuses were legalized, and African people were given responsibility of administering the townships. Okay, so this act changed the way that the townships were administrated. They had limited power and were still controlled by the state. They had a weak financial base and a lack of popular legitimacy because people thought they were sellouts to the white government, the people that would run the townships. Because these townships were self-financing, they were forced to raise rents in order to run townships effectively. This made them increasingly unpopular. Some councillors were corrupt, local authorities were rejected, and they were seen as an attempt by the state to deny them participation in a national democratic system. The black councillors were seen as sellouts to the apartheid system. Okay, and then the Trichomeral Parliament, which we spoke about a bit earlier, just going a bit more into depth with that. So a new parliamentary system was introduced, a tricameral parliament. Coloureds and Indians would be included in the government, while whites held the balance of power. Africans were included from the system. Okay, look at this, the tricameral parliament. The House of Assembly for whites, 178 seats. The House of Representatives for Coloureds, 85 seats. And the House of Delegates for Indians, 45 seats, which comes up to 130 seats versus 178 seats. The position of Prime Minister was abolished in favor of the Executive President. It was a cumbersome system, and in practice, the power remained in white hands because if you see, they held the majority of the vote. African people were excluded on the pretext that they would be able to vote in their homelands, so thus excluding them from election. The institution of the tricameral parliament caused great anger and led to popular revolt. Trade unions, schools, and civic organizations mobilized the masses to take part in resistance campaigns. Their actions made the country ungovernable and brought down the downfall of apartheid. Okay, and then the trade union movement. So earlier we learned that trade unions started to become more and more powerful. So African trade unions began to revive in the early 1970s. The Labor Relations Act legalized black trade unions, and strikes were now used to undermine the apartheid government. COSATU is a body that coordinated trade union actions. They developed close links with the ANC and played a significant role in the freedom struggle. It consisted of 30 non-racial unions and represented more than 500,000 workers, and it made a valuable contribution to the freedom struggle as their strike action weakened the economy and thus the government. Okay, and then response to all these reforms that we read about now. So protest marches were characterized by the Toy Toy dance. There was prolonged school boycotts. Learners adopted the slogan of liberation before education. Black councillors and other people believed to be collaborating with the government were killed. Barricades of stones and burning tires were erected to keep the police out of townships. Vigilante groups set up people's courts, so where they basically trial you by people. Law and order in the townships broke down, and this age of mass movement was led by the youth. Black consciousness created a new culture of self-confidence, and the ANC presence within South Africa increased as MK cadres made attacks on strategic and economic targets. These attacks boosted the ANC profile in South Africa and strengthened the resolve of activists to continue their fight against apartheid. Okay, and then the roles of civics, so churches, things like that. So churches are an important part of civil society as their membership is predominantly African. Church leaders such as Desmond Tutu, Alan Busak, and others became actively involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. The South African Council of Churches supported nonviolent action to end apartheid. It was in favor of trade sanctions and disinvestments as a means of bringing about change. So the role of civics, passive resistance. Then the role of the United Democratic Front, which was formed in response to the Trichomeral Parliament. So the United Democratic Front was affiliated with the ANC and supported the ideas in the Freedom Charter. There was a Don't Vote campaign, which aimed to discourage coloureds and Indians from participating in the elections for the Trichomeral Parliament. This campaign was a success. A 1 million signature campaign where activists went from door to door with a petition against apartheid. The aim was to make people aware of the need to organize and actively resist apartheid. Opposition to the Trichomeral Parliament unified the anti-apartheid forces, and this triggered a nationwide mass protest movement. Okay, and then the mass democratic movement. So the UDF, COSATU, and other protest organizations were banned by the government in 1988. And then MDM just took over the role of coordinating the process and resistance to apartheid. So the MDN had no permanent structures. It was an umbrella body that brought together the members of UDF, COSATU, and other resistance organizations. They encouraged acts of civil disobedience throughout the country. And volunteers deliberately defied segregation in hospitals, beaches, or public transport. And marches were held in cities to protest against police brutality and repressive legislation. And then the End Conscription Campaign. So when we think about this part, this is more for like the whites. So the whites had resistance to military conscription as P.W. Botha increased military conscription to 2 years. So they campaigned for an end to conscription, that troops should be withdrawn from townships, and an end to the South African participation in the war in Angola. They initiated awareness campaigns at white schools and universities and was banned in 1988, but still accomplished to sow doubts in the minds of many white people. South Africans started questioning the legitimacy of the wars being fought by the South African Defence Force in Namibia and Angola. So South Africans started to wonder about the legitimacy of the wars in Namibia and Angola, and the End Conscription Campaign provided a forum for those who opposed being part of military oppression within South Africa and enabled them to protest against apartheid by refusing to join the military. Okay, so let me quickly check here. So we did this section in our first bit of work, and we did this now. Okay, so the black sash. So white women with black sashes stood in silent protest, holding placards, protesting against apartheid injustices. So the black sash was a predominantly female movement. The black sash was committed to giving humanitarian and practical help to victims of apartheid laws. And then the international reaction to apartheid. So apartheid was widely criticized internationally, but little was done to force South African governments to abandon its policies. So the reason is obviously the Cold War. South Africa was a capitalist country, and Western powers feared that communism would take over in South Africa. Anti-apartheid groups were formed by ordinary people in several countries in Europe. These people were outraged by the human rights abuses occurring in South Africa and tried to persuade the governments to take action against the apartheid regime, specifically in Britain and Ireland. So a group of South African exiles and their British supporters held a meeting in London in 1959 to call for a boycott on the import of South African goods. This meeting marked the founding of the anti-apartheid movement. The anti-apartheid movement was also founded in Ireland, and AAM took an active role in the anti-apartheid movement by starting sports, cultural, economic, and academic boycotts, and by giving direct support to liberation movements like the ANC. Okay, and then they speak a bit about each boycott. So sports boycott, South Africa was banned from the Olympic Games. A cultural boycott, so no international stars visited South Africa, and television programs that could be bought by the SABC were limited. An academic boycott, which deprived South African academics of information needed for research. Some publishers refused to print work produced by South African scholars. And then a consumer boycott. They refused to buy South African products, a huge blow to farmers whose livelihood depended on the export of agricultural products. And disinvestment. So the AAM put pressure on British companies to withdraw their investments in South Africa. And many historians see sanctions as one of the most important factors in bringing about the downfall of apartheid. The decline in the economy as a result of sanctions put great pressure on government to change its policies, which brings us to the beginning of the end. So
Danielle,
following the collapse,
sorry to interrupt you.
no,
We've
it's
reached
fine.
the end of the session, yes. So,
Oh, okay,
for
it's
today,
fine.
you covered quite a lot in the session, so thank
Yeah, no,
you.
this was the last page that we had to do, so it's fine. We'll just do this page next week.
Wonderful. Thank you once again for joining us today and sharing some important tips for our learners as they prepare for the subject in terms of examination on history. And we look forward to having you back next week. Also, thanks to our viewers for tuning in. Remember, do like and share. And this is a recorded session, so you can always refer back to these slides. Thank you, Danielle, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Same to you. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all our viewers for tuning in.